Hey dudes, being a blacksmith in Colonial Boston wasn't badass. It was backbreaking. No gloves, no fans, just fire, smoke, and the constant ringing of hammer on iron. All day, every day. You didn't make swords for glory. You fixed horseshoes, bent nails, and breathed in soot until your teeth turned black. And the pay? Barely enough to buy bread. Tonight, we're stepping into that world. Into a workshop where the forge never sleeps, and the man behind the anvil is just trying to stay upright. If heavy, honest history helps you chill out, hit like and subscribe, and let me know in the comments, what time is it for you, and what's the worst job you've ever had? Now dim the lights, let the fire crackle in your mind, and fall asleep to a time when hard work was all there was. In Colonial Boston, blacksmiths were both revered and essential, yet their daily lives were far from glamorous. The blacksmith shop, typically located near the center of town, was the heart of industry. This is where tools were forged, horseshoes made, and even iron nails were crafted, each piece contributing to the colony's growth and survival. However, this critical role came with grueling labor and few rewards beyond the respect of a tight-knit community. The day of a colonial blacksmith began long before dawn. The forge was the center of activity, where the blacksmith worked tirelessly, bending the heat to shape metal into useful objects. The forge itself was no small setup, a large stone fireplace, filled with burning charcoal or wood, roared to life each morning. The heat was unbearable, often reaching temperatures where a single misstep could cause a severe burn. The blacksmith had to maintain the fire's intensity, constantly adjusting the bellows to ensure that the coal burned hot enough to melt the iron. The sound of hammer striking iron echoed throughout the neighborhood, a sound as familiar to the townspeople as the church bell. It was a rhythmic pounding, constant, steady. Blacksmiths were often so engrossed in their work that hours would pass without them realizing it. But it was not only the physical labor that was taxing. The work environment itself was hazardous. Breathing in the dust created by the forge and handling molten metal exposed the workers to long-term health risks, including respiratory problems and burns. The blacksmith's tasks were varied but exhausting. The demand for iron products was high. Colonial life depended on tools, wagons, nails, and even cooking utensils that a blacksmith could create. But the work wasn't limited to iron and steel. The blacksmith was also responsible for crafting agricultural tools like plows and sickles, crucial to the economy of the colony, which was still largely agrarian. Every task required skill and precision. Blacksmiths had to understand the properties of various metals, how they would react to heat and pressure. The process of forging tools was complex. Raw metal was heated in the forge until it glowed red hot. The blacksmith would then pull it out and use a hammer to shape it on an anvil. The metal cooled quickly, and the piece was constantly reheated and hammered, shaped and reshaped until it achieved its desired form. Iron was the primary metal used, but blacksmiths also worked with steel, brass, copper, and bronze. Each metal had different properties and required a unique approach. Steel was harder and tougher than iron, but it also had to be handled with care. Copper and brass, being softer, could be manipulated into delicate shapes. The ability to work with such a range of materials showcased the blacksmith's expertise and versatility. The blacksmith's day was physically demanding. The forge's heat caused the body to sweat continuously, which combined with the repetitive motion of hammering iron, created extreme exhaustion. Blacksmiths used their entire body in their craft. Their shoulders and arms were especially affected by the constant swinging of heavy hammers. A blacksmith's back could be sore after hours of standing at the anvil, and their hands would become calloused and rough from gripping the tools. In addition to the physical strain, the mental toll of the work was significant. The blacksmith worked long hours, often well into the evening, with little reprieve. There was no clock to mark the hours, just the fire that burned and the hammer that struck. Fatigue was a constant companion, yet there was little room for rest. Clients would come throughout the day to place orders, and blacksmiths were expected to fulfill those requests without delay. If a piece wasn't finished on time, it meant lost business, and for many, a loss of reputation. In winter, the cold could be just as harsh as the heat. While the forge offered warmth, outside temperatures could be brutal, and blacksmiths had to work long hours in drafty, poorly insulated buildings. The risk of illness, including pneumonia, was higher in these conditions, but the blacksmith couldn't afford to stop working. The forge was often the only source of income, and missing a day's work could mean a week without pay. Despite their critical role in the community, blacksmiths were not always respected. The nature of their work, the heat, and the filth associated with it placed them in a lower social class. They were not considered artisans in the same way that painters or sculptors were. The craftsmanship of a blacksmith, while invaluable, was often taken for granted. The community depended on them for essential tools and supplies, but they were seldom honored as high-status individuals. Blacksmiths were often seen as part of the working class, even though their work was fundamental to the success of colonial society. The social divide between the upper and lower classes was steep, and the blacksmiths, like many other tradespeople, occupied the bottom rungs of this ladder. Their work was highly skilled, yet they were rarely able to accumulate significant wealth or recognition for their contributions. However, blacksmiths did enjoy a certain level of influence in their own right. They were often involved in the local community and had a hand in decisions that affected day-to-day life. For example, blacksmiths frequently crafted the iron hinges for doors and gates, or the locks for barns and homes, making them an essential part of community life. Despite their lower social standing, they had a deep, lasting connection to the people they served. Despite their importance, blacksmiths faced challenges in the form of competition. New technology and methods gradually began to shift the demand for hand-forged goods. With the rise of industrial tools and mass production, the blacksmith's role became more specialized and less in demand for general production. Blacksmiths would have to constantly adapt to changing times, sometimes embracing new machinery or learning new skills. However, even with the advent of new tools, the blacksmith's trade remained vital for repairs and custom work. Many blacksmiths would find ways to diversify their services, perhaps moving into areas such as wheelwrighting, or even offering services for military purposes, such as repairing muskets or making armor for local militias. The life of a colonial blacksmith was tough, consuming, exhausting, and often thankless. Yet, despite the grueling work and lack of recognition, these craftsmen were vital to the survival and growth of the early American colonies. How did their labor affect the broader development of colonial Boston? Could this physically demanding role evolve in the face of emerging technologies and industrialization? The life of a colonial blacksmith was one that involved a vast array of skills and the mastery of many tools. Each piece of metal that passed through their hands required intricate knowledge, experience, and an understanding of both the materials they were working with and the needs of the community they served. Blacksmiths were more than mere laborers. They were skilled craftsmen whose work required precision, patience, and adaptability. The heart of every blacksmith's workshop was the forge. Without the intense heat of the forge, no work could be done. The forge itself was typically a large stone or brick structure, built to withstand the heat required for melting and molding metal. It was fueled by a combination of coal and wood, which fed a roaring fire that could reach temperatures of up to 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit. The forge was carefully controlled using bellows, which were operated by hand or foot to regulate the airflow and increase the heat when necessary. The blacksmith would place raw pieces of metal, usually iron or steel, into the forge, heating them until they glowed bright red or yellow. The process of heating metal was vital because it made it malleable enough to be shaped, twisted, and bent. The intense heat made the metal easier to forge, but it also brought with it risks. The blacksmith had to be cautious about the metal, overheating and becoming brittle or burning. The skill to control the temperature was an art form in itself. A blacksmith's workshop was filled with an array of tools, each serving a specific purpose in the process of shaping metal. While the forge and bellows were the most critical tools, the blacksmith's collection of hammers, anvils, tongs, and chisels were just as important. These tools varied greatly in size and function, each suited to different tasks. Hammer. The hammer was perhaps the most iconic tool of the blacksmith. It came in various forms: light hammers for delicate work, heavy ones for shaping larger pieces. The hammer's head was typically made of steel, and its weight and balance were crucial. For the blacksmith's efficiency, a master blacksmith would develop a feel for the hammer, using its weight and swing to control the force applied to the metal. Anvil. The anvil, usually made of cast iron, was the work surface for shaping the metal. Its flat surface was where most of the hammering took place. The anvil also had a pointed section, known as the horn, which was used for bending and shaping metal. The anvil was one of the most durable and important tools in the blacksmith's workshop. Tongs. Tongs were essential for holding the hot metal as it was worked. Blacksmiths used different types of tongs depending on the size and shape of the metal. Long-handled tongs allowed the blacksmith to keep a safe distance from the scorching hot material while shaping it on the anvil. Chisels and punches. For more delicate work, blacksmiths employed chisels and punches to carve designs or to make smaller holes in metal. These tools required great skill and control to use effectively. Vices. The blacksmith often used a vise, or clamp to hold pieces of metal while they were being worked on. The vise was especially useful for tasks that required precise control, like filing or cutting. Each of these tools required constant maintenance and repair. The blacksmith's skill was not just in using them, but also in making sure they were well maintained. Tools needed to be sharpened and oiled regularly to keep them functioning at peak efficiency. Once the metal was heated to the right temperature, it was time to begin the process of shaping it. The blacksmith would remove the glowing metal from the forge using long tongs and place it on the anvil. With a hammer in hand, the blacksmith would begin striking the metal, carefully controlling the direction and force of each blow. The metal would often be rotated, flipped, and reshaped in various ways. For example, a blacksmith forging a horseshoe would start by hammering a flat piece of iron into a long bar. The bar would then be bent into a semicircular shape, and the edges would be shaped to fit the horse's hooves. The blacksmith's expertise came not only in the ability to shape the metal, but also in the understanding of how it would respond to the force and heat. The process was slow and methodical, requiring both strength and finesse. Each strike had to be carefully placed to ensure the metal didn't break, warp, or overheat. The blacksmith would sometimes dip the metal into water or oil to cool it, a technique known as quenching. Quenching was used to harden the metal, giving it strength, but it was a tricky process. If the metal was cooled too quickly or unevenly, it could crack or become brittle. Blacksmiths were responsible for creating a wide variety of tools and objects that were vital to daily life. One of the most important products of the blacksmith's forge was nails. In colonial Boston, nails were not mass-produced. Each one had to be hand-forged. Making nails was a meticulous task, where the blacksmith would cut a small piece of iron, heat it, and then hammer it into a long, tapered shape. The point would be sharpened, and the nail would be quenched to harden it. It was a simple task, but it required great skill and attention to detail. Other important products of the blacksmith's workshop included farm tools, such as plows, sickles, and hoes, as well as everyday items like cooking utensils and locks. Blacksmiths also crafted decorative objects, including gates, fences, and other ironwork, often in the form of intricate scrolls or floral patterns. Each piece was crafted for durability and utility. A blacksmith's work was built to last, which is why so many of the products they created are still in use today. Many tools passed down through generations were still as functional as they were when first created. In large towns or cities, blacksmiths often specialized in specific types of work. Some blacksmiths focused primarily on making horseshoes, while others might specialize in the production of nails. Some even worked as armorers, creating weapons or protective gear for soldiers. A master blacksmith, known for their skill and reputation, could command higher prices for their work and often had apprentices or journeymen working under them. In addition to producing tools and hardware, blacksmiths were often called upon to repair items. If a farmer's plow broke, a blacksmith could fix it. If a wheel on a wagon became cracked, the blacksmith could make new wheel rims or forge replacement parts. They were the go-to tradesmen for repairs, and their work often required quick thinking and improvisation. As the colonies grew, so did the demand for blacksmiths. The increasing population required more goods, and the expansion of agriculture and industry meant that there were more tools and machines to maintain. Even in an age of growing mechanization, blacksmiths continued to play an essential role in both maintaining the technology of the time and adapting to new innovations. Having mastered the tools and skills of the trade, the blacksmith was ready to adapt to an ever-changing world. How would the advancements in technology affect their trade? Could their craftsmanship survive the rise of industrialization and mass production? As colonial Boston grew into a burgeoning port city, the once crucial role of the blacksmith began to change. The rapid advances in industry and technology during the 19th century, especially with the Industrial Revolution, would forever alter the nature of craftsmanship. The blacksmith's world, once dominated by hand-forged metalwork and the rhythmic clang of hammer on anvil, began to fade as machines replaced skilled labor. How did this shift affect the blacksmith, and did any survive in an increasingly industrialized world? The Industrial Revolution, which took off in Britain in the late 18th century and spread to the United States in the early 19th century, was a period marked by monumental changes in manufacturing and production. The introduction of machines to the production process made it possible to produce items faster and more efficiently than ever before. This was the beginning of mass production, the very thing that would challenge the blacksmith's place in society. The first major blow to the blacksmith's role came with the advent of steam-powered machinery. Steam engines could now perform tasks that were previously done by hand. In fact, steam-powered hammers were introduced to take over some of the work that had been done manually by blacksmiths. These machines were able to strike with greater force, faster than any human could, making them much more efficient. Factories sprang up, filled with machines designed to mass-produce goods like nails, tools, and even horseshoes. Items that once required hours of painstaking work to forge could now be produced in minutes. As a result, the demand for hand-forged products dropped dramatically. What had once been the job of a skilled craftsman, shaping metal into usable tools, was now being done by machines at a fraction of the cost and time. In the early days of the Industrial Revolution, many blacksmiths attempted to adapt by integrating new technologies into their workshops. Some adopted steam-powered hammers, or machinery that helped with the forging process. But for many, the introduction of factory-made goods spelled the end of their business. Large factories, often located in cities, became the central hubs for metalwork production. These factories employed many people and were capable of producing vast quantities of goods. The blacksmith, with his small, hand-operated forge, simply could not compete with the scale and speed of factory production. While a skilled blacksmith might have been able to make a few dozen nails or horseshoes in a day, factories could churn out thousands in the same time. Many small independent blacksmith shops closed as a result, and the blacksmithing profession shifted from a widely respected trade to a much less prominent specialized craft. The simple tools and household items that blacksmiths had once created became mass-produced, cheap alternatives, and fewer people required custom-made items. Not all blacksmiths disappeared during this time, however. Some found new ways to adapt by specializing in niche areas that industrialized factories could not easily handle. Custom metalwork, such as decorative gates, railings, and furniture, was one area where blacksmiths continued to thrive. These items required a level of craftsmanship and artistry that machines could not replicate. In cities like Boston, blacksmiths began to focus on fine metalwork for wealthy clients who demanded unique, handcrafted items. The craftsmanship required for these specialized goods could not be mass-produced, and thus some blacksmiths managed to preserve their livelihood by focusing on custom orders. Another area where blacksmiths found new opportunities was in the repair of machinery and industrial equipment. As factories flourished and industrial machinery became more common, blacksmiths with the right skills were needed to repair and maintain the metalwork in these machines. This allowed some blacksmiths to remain relevant, but their work had shifted from creating tools and hardware to fixing and maintaining industrial equipment. The role of the blacksmith also evolved socially as industrialization transformed the American economy. In the early days of the colonies, blacksmiths were some of the most important figures in the community. They provided everything from nails to farming tools, and their role in society was highly respected. By the time the Industrial Revolution reached full force, blacksmithing had shifted to a specialized trade, and its status in society was greatly diminished. Factory owners and industrialists became the new symbols of power and wealth, while the blacksmith became just another tradesman, struggling to adapt to a changing world. The expansion of railroads and factories, which had once been dependent on the blacksmith's craft, was now being driven by machinery, diminishing the blacksmith's influence in the industrial landscape. The democratization of production meant that even skilled laborers had to adapt to new economic realities. The individual blacksmith, working in a small shop, could no longer compete with the power of factories that produced mass quantities of metal products at a fraction of the cost. Despite the decline of traditional blacksmithing, the legacy of these craftsmen has endured. While the vast majority of blacksmiths were eventually replaced by machines, their contributions to the development of the American colonies and the early United States remain significant. The tools and goods they produced helped shape the country's economy, and their craftsmanship influenced generations of artisans and tradesmen who came after them. Moreover, the techniques developed by blacksmiths, especially in the realm of forging and metalworking, laid the foundation for modern industries. Today, blacksmithing is still practiced by some artisans and hobbyists who appreciate the beauty of hand-forged metalwork, and the tools and skills used by blacksmiths are still taught in workshops and schools around the world. Though the Industrial Revolution brought an end to the blacksmith's dominance, it also marked the beginning of a new era of mass production that would shape the modern world. Blacksmiths may no longer dominate industry, but their legacy of craftsmanship, skill, and innovation has had a lasting impact on American society and industry. The blacksmith's decline in the industrial age represents the changing nature of work itself. It is a reflection of how, throughout history, technological advancements have disrupted traditional trades and industries. The blacksmith's craft, once central to daily life in colonial America, was replaced by machines, but the skill and artistry of these men did not disappear entirely. The story of the colonial blacksmith serves as a reminder of the resilience of craftsmanship and the ever-changing nature of human ingenuity. As the Industrial Revolution reshaped the world, the colonial blacksmith's trade slowly disappeared from the spotlight. What does the decline of blacksmithing tell us about the broader societal shifts brought by industrialization? Can craftsmanship still survive in a world dominated by machines? In colonial America, long before the era of newspapers, radios, and the internet, the town crier was the vital link between the events unfolding in a community and the people who lived there. Imagine the bustling streets of a colonial town, narrow cobblestone pathways lined with shops, homes, and taverns, and amidst it all, the loud, authoritative voice of the town crier. His role was indispensable, his presence critical to ensuring the flow of information in a time when literacy rates were still developing and mass communication had not yet been invented. The town crier was not simply a bearer of news, but the lifeblood of the community. He made sure the news reached every corner, from the local farmers working the fields to the merchants in their shops. But how did this role evolve, and how did it reflect the daily rhythms of colonial life? The tradition of town criers can be traced back to ancient civilizations, where they were used to spread royal decrees and announcements in a public forum. In colonial America, this practice carried on, adapted to the needs of the growing settlements. While the written word was gaining importance, especially among the educated elite, much of the population was still illiterate or semi-literate. Newspapers, although beginning to emerge, were expensive and not widely distributed in the early colonial period. As a result, the town crier became the most important source of public news, particularly in smaller towns and villages. The crier's primary job was to read aloud important news and announcements, such as laws, proclamations from the governor, births, deaths, marriages, local events, and public meetings. In a time when printed news was scarce, and oral communication was the key to spreading information, the crier stood as the authoritative voice in the town square. The town crier's day would begin early, often before the sun rose. Armed with a bell, which he would ring to attract attention, he would march through the streets, calling out to the citizens who had yet to hear the latest news. "Hear ye! Hear ye!" he would cry out, signaling the start of his announcement. The bell was not just a tool to gather attention, but a symbol of authority. As he traversed the streets, he would stop at strategic locations, like the town square, near the market, or at the entrance to the courthouse, to ensure the widest possible audience. Once the crier had gathered the people, he would read aloud the proclamations. These could include anything from the death of a prominent citizen to new laws issued by the governor, upcoming public events like fairs or town meetings, or important changes to the community's infrastructure, such as the construction of a new road or bridge. The content of his messages varied, but they all served to keep the community informed about the decisions and events that shaped their lives. One of the most important duties of the town crier was announcing criminal proceedings or punishments. If someone was accused of a crime, such as theft, the crier would proclaim the charges in the streets, ensuring that everyone knew the consequences of unlawful behavior. The crier was also called upon to read out proclamations about public executions, which were often public spectacles in colonial America. These announcements ensured that the justice system was transparent and that citizens were aware of the legal consequences of their actions. Though the town crier was primarily a messenger, he played an essential role in shaping the public life of a colonial town. As the messenger of the government, the church, and the local community, the crier had access to the most important information. His announcements were often one of the few means of transmitting critical information about events far beyond the town's immediate boundaries. He wasn't just a mouthpiece. In many ways, he shaped how people responded to the news. The crier was a bridge between the authorities and the common people. His voice carried the weight of official announcements, and in some cases, his tone and delivery could influence how the message was received. The crier's ability to read with clarity and emotion made him an integral part of shaping public perception. A well-spoken crier could have a dramatic impact on how an announcement was interpreted, whether it was news of a celebration or the declaration of a new law. It's important to remember that in colonial America, literacy rates were not universal. While some towns boasted high literacy rates, many residents, especially in rural areas, did not have access to education. In these communities, the crier was not just a messenger, but a crucial conduit for news. For many, hearing the news read aloud by the crier was the only way to stay informed about local and regional developments. The crier's role as an oral communicator was also crucial in fostering a sense of community. The people gathered around. The crier in the streets were not just passive listeners. They were active participants in the civic life of their town. Whether in celebration or distress, the crier's words served to unite the community, providing them with the information they needed to make decisions, take action, or simply understand the events unfolding around them. The appearance of the town crier was as much a part of his role as his announcements. The crier typically wore a distinctive uniform, often a brightly coloured coat, a sash, and a tricorn hat, which set him apart from the ordinary townsfolk. His bell was a key element of his attire, and it symbolized his role as the town's voice. The uniform, combined with the sound of the bell, made him an instantly recognizable figure in any town or village. Town criers were also called upon to announce important ceremonies. These could include public celebrations, such as feasts, festivals, or holidays, as well as more somber events, like funerals or memorials for public figures. The crier's presence was a necessary part of formal occasions, and his words could imbue the event with a sense of importance and grandeur. Even though many of the crier's duties revolved around mundane announcements, his involvement in ceremonies and events helped elevate the status of the occasion. For example, when a new law was passed or a significant milestone was reached by the colony, the crier's announcement would often be accompanied by the ringing of bells and a formal reading, which gave the news a sense of gravity and significance. Despite his crucial role in colonial America, the town crier faced significant challenges. For one, as newspapers began to gain popularity, especially in the latter part of the 18th century, the crier's importance began to wane. Printed materials allowed for more widespread distribution of news, and literacy rates began to rise. The advent of newspapers in larger towns and cities diminished the need for the crier's daily rounds, as written news became more accessible to those who could read. In addition, the rise of more organized forms of government and law enforcement meant that proclamations and announcements were being disseminated in new ways, through written edicts and formal channels. The town crier, who once had an important role as the sole messenger of the government, was now competing with other forms of communication. However, the role of the town crier was not entirely lost. In some places, especially in rural communities, town criers continued to be a necessary part of civic life until the 19th century. Even in urban centres, the crier's role persisted for some time as a ceremonial figure, particularly for important legal or political events. In the era of newspapers and growing literacy, the role of the town crier began to diminish. But in a world without the instant access to information we have today, the crier was indispensable. What, then, did the end of the crier's role signify? For the changing relationship between government, the media, and the people? How did it reflect the broader transformation of communication in early America? The town crier was not just an announcer of mundane news, but a figure whose voice had the power to shape the very fabric of colonial society. In an era when communication was limited, and the written word was often out of reach for many, the crier's proclamations held a great deal of weight. His words could inspire people to act, stir up public sentiment, or even change the course of events. The role of the crier was particularly important in times of political unrest, when his influence extended beyond simple announcements, becoming a tool of both governance and rebellion. The town crier's most prominent role was serving as the messenger of authority. His announcements were often the first direct communication from the government or local officials to the public. This made him an integral part of the governing process in colonial America. Whether it was the announcement of a new law or the reading of a royal proclamation, the crier's voice was one of the few channels through which the colonial government could engage with its people. In many ways, the crier acted as a symbol of authority. His proclamations were not merely messages to be heard. They carried the weight of the government or the monarch behind them. A simple, hear ye," from the town crier could mean the difference between a lawful gathering or a mob of rebellious townsfolk. The crier's ability to read proclamations with clarity and conviction gave his announcements a sense of gravity, as if they were etched in stone. But his role was not without its challenges. Often, the crier had to navigate the complex relationship between the people and the government. While the crier may have been the mouthpiece of the authorities, he was also, in many cases, deeply enmeshed in the community. His role was not simply to convey orders from on high, but also to be an active participant in the town's life. This dual role as both messenger of authority and member of the community could put him in difficult situations, especially when the news he was tasked to announce was unpopular or controversial. The town crier's influence became particularly significant in the years leading up to the American Revolution. In a time when communication was slow and unreliable, the crier became a central figure in spreading the news of revolutionary events. Town criers were among the first to announce the colonial boycotts, the battles, and the signing of key documents. They were often the messengers of rebellion, spreading information about the growing tensions between the colonies and Britain. The crier was instrumental in communicating the colonial response to British policies like the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts. As tensions between the colonies and the Crown reached a boiling point, town criers helped unite the people through their announcements. In Boston, for example, criers would announce meetings of the Sons of Liberty, the group that would become central to the colonial resistance movement. The criers' proclamations could rally the colonists, stirring up passions and encouraging participation in acts of resistance. Perhaps one of the most famous examples of the crier's role in revolutionary events came on the night of Paul Revere's ride. As Revere and his fellow riders warned the townspeople of the British advance, the town crier was also on hand to sound the alarm. The crier's role in spreading the word of the British March was not just about announcing a threat. It was about inspiring action. His cry, "The British are coming," although often attributed to Revere, would have echoed through the streets, urging the local militias to gather and prepare for battle. The crier's influence, though less celebrated than the actions of Revere, was critical in rallying the people to fight for their independence. The influence of the town crier was not limited to political events. He also played a crucial role in the religious and social life of colonial America. In many communities, the crier was responsible for announcing church services and other religious gatherings. He was the one who would call people to prayer, alerting them to the times for Mass or other religious observances. In a predominantly Christian society, the crier's voice carried the message of the church, just as it did for the government. The crier was also involved in other public events that held social importance. Town fairs, festivals, and public celebrations would often be announced by the crier. These gatherings were an important part of colonial life, offering the people a break from the hardships of daily existence and a chance to come together as a community. The crier's proclamations, ringing out across the town, would call everyone to join in the festivities, whether it was for a harvest celebration or a local holiday. Even in times of tragedy, the town crier's voice could bring the community together. The crier would announce deaths, funerals, and memorial services, helping to ensure that these solemn events were observed with the respect and dignity they deserved. His voice was a reminder of the shared human experience, the joys, the sorrows, and the collective bond of community. In a time of political upheaval, the town crier's influence could be harnessed as a tool of propaganda. Just as the government relied on him to spread news of new laws or edicts, so too could the crier be used to promote specific political agendas. This was particularly evident during times of war, when the crier's words could sway public sentiment. During the French and Indian War, for example, the crier was used to rally the colonists in support of British efforts against the French. The crier's announcements, which often described the war as a righteous cause, could stir up nationalistic fervor among the people. In contrast, during the American Revolution, the crier's proclamations would encourage resistance against the British Crown. His voice, which had once carried royal decrees, was now used to denounce British policies and to unite the colonists in their fight for independence. In this way, the town crier became an important instrument in shaping the political landscape of colonial America. His words carried the power to sway public opinion and to mobilize people for a cause. Whether in support of the monarchy or in defiance of it, the crier's influence was undeniable. As the 19th century progressed, the influence of the town crier began to wane. The advent of newspapers, which became more widespread as printing. Technology improved, meant that written news could be distributed more efficiently than ever before. People could now read the news for themselves, and literacy rates rose, reducing the need for oral announcements. With the rise of mass communication technologies, such as the telegraph and eventually radio, the town crier's role became increasingly obsolete. His once dominant position as the primary source of public information was supplanted by more modern forms of communication. However, despite his decline, the town crier's legacy lived on in the form of modern journalism, which still bears the imprint of the crier's function as a deliverer of public news. While the role of the town crier has largely disappeared, his influence can still be seen in modern media. The idea of the crier as a direct and authoritative voice can be found in the way news anchors, reporters, and journalists deliver important updates to the public today. In many ways, the town crier was the precursor to modern broadcast journalism, delivering timely information and shaping public opinion through the power of his voice. Even today, the act of proclaiming the news remains at the heart of the journalistic profession, just as it did for the crier centuries ago. In a world of instant communication and constant news cycles, the crier's duty to deliver important news in a clear and direct manner continues to resonate with the way we consume information. The town crier's influence extended far beyond merely announcing news. His voice had the power to stir up emotions, rally communities, and shape the course of history. As mass communication evolved, the role of the crier diminished, but his impact can still be felt in the media landscape today. What can we learn from the crier's role in colonial society about the power of communication and its ability to unite or divide people? By the mid-19th century, the town crier, once a central figure in the communication landscape of colonial America, began to fade into obscurity. As the population grew and cities became more urbanized, the dynamics of communication changed dramatically. The rise of new technologies, the expansion of the postal service, and the increasing availability of newspapers marked the decline of the town crier's role. But how did this evolution unfold, and what does it say about the broader changes in American society? The town crier's decline coincided with the rise of the newspaper industry in America. In the late 18th century, printing presses were becoming more widespread, and newspapers began to emerge as a primary source of information. The advent of newspapers offered a more permanent, accessible, and reliable means of communication compared to the crier's oral announcements. Newspapers provided a written record that people could keep, share, and refer back to. While the town crier's announcements were fleeting, disappearing as quickly as they were spoken, newspapers allowed for a more lasting form of communication. By the 19th century, as literacy rates increased, people were able to read the news for themselves. This shift in communication methods made the town crier, whose job was to speak news aloud in the streets, largely redundant. As newspapers grew in prominence, so did the postal service. The establishment of reliable and efficient mail systems in the early 19th century further reduced the need for a town crier. Letters, pamphlets, and newspapers could now be delivered to households directly, allowing individuals to stay informed without having to wait for the crier's announcement in the town square. With the invention of the telegraph in the 1830s and 1840s, even faster communication became possible. The telegraph allowed for the transmission of messages over long distances in mere minutes, revolutionizing the speed at which news could be shared. This new technology diminished the need for local vocal messengers like the town crier, who could only reach as far as his voice could carry. While the telegraph was mainly used for business and governmental communication, it marked a major shift in how information was disseminated. For the first time, news could travel across vast distances in an instant, rendering the crier's role, who had once been the town's only link to faraway events, outdated. The advent of these technologies represented a broader shift in communication from oral to written and later electronic forms. The oral culture of the colonial period, where spoken word was the primary mode of sharing news, was gradually replaced by written records and eventually by broadcast media. In this transformation, the town crier, who relied solely on his voice to communicate, found his position increasingly irrelevant. Written communication offered a degree of permanence that oral announcements could never match. Written messages could be saved, passed around, and reviewed at will. The physical act of writing itself also helped standardize the message, reducing the potential for miscommunication. As people began to trust the written word more than oral traditions, the town crier's role was slowly phased out in favor of new, more reliable methods of communication. While the town crier began to disappear in urban centers, his role persisted in some rural areas. In more isolated regions, where the postal service was not as developed and literacy rates remained low, the town crier still had a place. Small towns and villages, where people gathered in public spaces and news travelled more slowly, continued to rely on the crier to spread important announcements. In these rural settings, the crier remained a vital part of daily life for much longer than in cities. In fact, some communities maintained their criers well into the 20th century. However, these instances were the exception rather than the rule, and the crier's influence in American life was now firmly on the decline. Although the town crier had lost much of his practical function by the 19th century, he was not entirely forgotten. The crier's iconic uniform and his bell, symbols of public authority, began to take on a more ceremonial and symbolic role in some communities. In certain areas, town criers were still employed for public events, such as celebrations, parades, or grand openings, where their distinctive voice and attire added to the atmosphere of the occasion. The crier also became a nostalgic figure, representing an earlier, simpler time. As cities modernized and technology took over communication, the image of the town crier became associated with the past. He was no longer a necessary figure, but a relic of a bygone era. The crier, in his bell and tricorn hat, became a symbol of colonial America, evoking a sense of tradition and history. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the town crier had all but disappeared from American life. With the proliferation of printed newspapers, telephones, radios, and later, television, the need for a town crier was gone. The once vital role of the crier, who had been responsible for announcing laws, news, and events to an entire community, had been overtaken by more efficient and widespread methods of communication. In the context of American history, the decline of the town crier marks a significant shift in the way people received information. It is a reflection of the broader societal changes brought about by industrialization, urbanization, and the rise of mass communication. What was once an important civic role became obsolete in the face of technological progress. Yet the town crier's legacy lives on in the modern media we consume every day. Despite the disappearance of the town crier, his influence can still be felt in modern society. The crier's job was not just about relaying news. It was about bringing people together, creating a shared experience of public life. Today, journalists, news anchors, and broadcasters continue the crier's work, though in a much more complex and rapid-paced environment. The crier also paved the way for the development of public relations and advertising. His ability to capture the attention of the public with a loud voice and a clear message has been mirrored in modern marketing techniques. Even today, the ability to grab attention with a strong voice or a catchy message is at the heart of effective communication. Moreover, the town crier's role in the American Revolution is a reminder of how communication can shape the course of history. The crier's voice helped to spread the ideas of liberty and resistance, fostering the spirit of rebellion that led to the nation's independence. The legacy of the town crier is not just about the information he spread, but about his role in uniting communities and shaping public sentiment in times of crisis. As the crier's role diminished with the rise of new communication technologies, his influence can still be seen today in the ways information is shared, whether in the news, public ceremonies, or social movements. How did the evolution from the town crier to modern communication reflect the broader societal changes of the 19th and 20th centuries? In medieval England, the vast majority of people lived in the countryside, eking out a living from the land. They were farmers, peasants who worked tirelessly from dawn until dusk, cultivating crops and tending to livestock, all while being bound by the rigid structures of the feudal system. The life of a poor farmer, while essential to the medieval economy, was marked by constant hardship and uncertainty. Life for these peasants was governed by the seasons, the land, and the demands of their lords. But despite their lowly status, they played a central role in sustaining society. They were the ones who sowed the seeds, reaped the harvest, and raised the animals that fed the kingdom. However, this was a life of endless toil and meager rewards, and survival was always precarious. A typical day for a poor farmer in medieval England began long before the sun was fully up. The farmer would rise from his modest home, often a one-room cottage made of wattle and daub, with a thatched roof. The interior was simple: a hearth for cooking, a few pieces of furniture, and perhaps a small bed shared with the rest of the family. Light was scarce, and the home was often dark even during the day, with only a small fire providing heat and light during the colder months. The first task of the day was typically to tend to the animals. Most peasant farms would keep a few cows, chickens, or sheep, depending on the region and the resources available. The farmer would milk the cows, gather the eggs, and check on the condition of any other livestock. Livestock was crucial for survival, providing not only food in the form of milk, eggs, and meat, but also valuable byproducts like wool for clothing or leather for shoes and tools. Once the animals had been fed, the farmer would turn to his crops. Medieval English farmers grew a variety of crops, but the most common were wheat, barley, oats, and rye. These were essential for bread and ale, the staples of the medieval diet. However, not all peasants could afford to grow wheat. Many poorer farmers grew oats or rye, which were hardier and could survive in less fertile soil. The day's work was dictated by the seasons. In the spring, the farmer would plant his crops. This was a labor-intensive process requiring the use of plows and hand tools to prepare the soil. Most peasant farmers did not own a horse-drawn plow and would instead use an ox or, more commonly, work the fields themselves, dragging a simple wooden plow through the soil. Plowing was physically demanding work, and the soil was often heavy and difficult to turn. Fields had to be plowed, harrowed to break up the soil further, and then sowed with seed. This was done by hand, and the peasant would have to make sure the seed was spread evenly, without wasting too much. Any misstep in planting could lead to poor yields or crop failure. The growing season was short, and the weather played a significant role in determining whether the harvest would be successful. For the poor farmer, the fate of the crops was out of his hands. A summer drought could ruin the harvest, while excessive rain could flood the fields and destroy the crops. In a time before modern irrigation or crop management techniques, the farmer's success or failure was often determined by factors beyond his control. Throughout the summer, the farmer would spend his days weeding and tending to the crops. This was back-breaking work, done by hand with simple tools like a hoe or a scythe. Weeding was important not just to allow crops to grow, but to prevent the spread of diseases that could decimate the harvest. Peasants were particularly vulnerable to crop diseases and pests, which could lead to famine if they were left unchecked. In addition to working the land for their own sustenance, peasants were required to give a significant portion of their harvest to their lord. The lord, who owned the land, had the right to collect tithes and rents from his peasants. The tithe was often 1/10 of the crops or livestock, and it was paid directly to the church or to the lord in exchange for the right to live on and farm the land. In addition to this, the farmer often had to pay rents in the form of crops or labour to the lord, further reducing the little they could keep for themselves. The lord also had the right to require the peasant to work his lands. This was known as corvée labour and was a form of forced labour. A poor farmer might be expected to work on the lord's estate a certain number of days a week or month, using his skills and labour to maintain the lord's property. This labour was unpaid and added another burden to an already grueling existence. The feudal system that governed medieval England created a complex web of obligations and responsibilities. While the peasant worked hard to provide for his family, much of his labor and harvest was siphoned off by the landowner. This left the poor farmer with very little, despite the immense effort put into working the land. One of the most pressing concerns for medieval farmers was hunger. Even in years when the harvest was good, there was never enough to store up for the winter. The medieval peasant often lived on the brink of starvation, especially in times of bad harvests. Food preservation techniques were limited, and much of the grain grown had to be consumed quickly to avoid spoilage. There were no refrigerators, and storage options were poor, making it difficult to keep food for the long, harsh winters. In addition to the threat of hunger, peasants also faced the constant threat of disease. Without modern medicine, even a minor illness could become fatal. The poor living conditions, crowded homes, and lack of sanitation made disease easy to spread. The Black Death, which swept through Europe in the 14th century, decimated entire villages, killing nearly 1/3 of the population in some areas. Even without such catastrophic events, peasants faced regular outbreaks of plagues, fevers, and other diseases that claimed the lives of children and adults alike. The life expectancy for a medieval farmer was short. Most people did not live beyond their 40s, and many children died before reaching adulthood. Infant mortality rates were high, and life was fragile. The harshness of medieval life, combined with the constant labor and the vulnerability to disease, meant that survival was never guaranteed. The work of the farm was a family affair. Peasant families were often large, with multiple children helping out in the fields. Children were expected to assist from a young age, whether it was by feeding animals, gathering firewood, or helping in the harvest. Girls helped with domestic tasks, like preparing meals, mending clothes, and managing the household, while boys assisted in farming and animal care. Family members worked together to ensure the survival of the household. In addition to the hard labor, the family often depended on one another for emotional support. While the work was taxing, the family was a source of comfort in difficult times. At the end of the day, after a long day in the fields, families would gather around the hearth, sharing a meager meal of bread, vegetables, and perhaps some meat or cheese if they were fortunate. The life of a medieval farmer was closely tied to the rhythms of the seasons. In the winter, the work slowed down, and the farmer would often spend his time mending tools or making repairs to the farmstead. The long, cold months were a time of rest, though even then, the farmer had to remain vigilant. In spring, the cycle of planting began again, and the grueling labor of sowing, tending, and harvesting began anew. The farmer's life was governed by a constant cycle of labor and uncertainty. The success of his crops, the health of his family, and his ability to pay his rent and tithes were always at the mercy of external forces. But despite the hardships, the peasant was resilient. Year after year, they endured the challenges of the land, driven by the necessity of survival. Life as a medieval farmer was one of hardship, dictated by the seasons and the land. With limited resources, a harsh climate, and the ever-present weight of obligations to the Lord, how did the medieval peasant manage to survive? And what did their endurance and resilience mean for the survival of feudal society? The life of a medieval farmer, though deeply rooted in tradition, was also one marked by gradual innovations in agricultural techniques. These innovations were critical not only for survival, but also for the development of medieval society. While much of the farming was labor-intensive and primitive by today's standards, several key developments helped farmers increase productivity and adapt to changing circumstances. Despite the harsh conditions they faced, farmers worked with what they had, employing a combination of practical knowledge passed down through generations and newly introduced methods that slowly transformed the landscape of medieval agriculture. Farming in medieval England was an overwhelmingly labor-intensive process. The land was tilled using simple tools, many of which had been used for centuries. The most basic of these was the wooden plough, a simple implement that was drawn by oxen, horses, or in some cases, human power. This plough was used to break up the soil, making it possible to plant crops. The lack of sophisticated ploughing technology made tilling the land a time-consuming process, especially in areas with heavy, clay-like soil. The farmer would then scatter seed by hand, a process known as broadcasting. This was a slow method of sowing that left much of the field unproductive. If the weather was favorable and the seeds germinated well, the harvest could be plentiful, but this method of planting had its drawbacks. Seedlings could be planted too close together, leading to overcrowding, or seeds could be lost to birds and other pests, reducing crop yields. While many farmers supplemented their diets with vegetables like peas, carrots, and onions, grains such as wheat, barley, oats, and rye formed the cornerstone of the medieval English diet. The harrowing process, which involved breaking up soil after ploughing, was also done by hand using a simple wooden harrow. While the harrow could help aerate the soil, it was also dependent on manpower or the use of animals to drag it across the field, making it slow and tedious. The effectiveness of these methods varied by region, and their limitations meant that agricultural productivity could be easily impacted by adverse weather or poor soil conditions. One of the most significant agricultural innovations during the medieval period was the development of the heavy plough. The heavy plough, which originated in the early medieval period and became more widespread by the 9th and 10th centuries, was a major leap forward in terms of efficiency and productivity. Unlike the simple wooden plough, the heavy plough had a metal tip that allowed it to break through tough, clay-heavy soil. The increased depth and force of the heavy plough meant that farmers could now cultivate land that had previously been too difficult to till. This innovation was particularly important in regions of northern Europe, including England, where the soil was dense and resistant to traditional ploughing methods. The heavy plough revolutionized farming, increasing the amount of land that could be cultivated and, ultimately, boosting food production. As a result, this technological advancement laid the foundation for population growth and urbanization, as it enabled the support of larger communities. The heavy plough required more labor and more draft animals, which further entrenched the role of oxen in medieval farming. The plough's effectiveness was also tied to the seasons, as it could only be used when the ground was sufficiently moist, typically in the spring. Despite these limitations, the heavy plough marked a significant shift in agricultural practices, and its widespread adoption had lasting effects on medieval farming. Another key innovation in medieval farming was the practice of crop rotation. This system involved rotating different crops across the same fields in a set pattern, with the primary aim of improving soil fertility and reducing the risk of disease and pest infestation. Crop rotation was especially important in the absence of modern fertilizers, as it helped prevent the depletion of essential nutrients in the soil. The most common system of crop rotation in medieval England was a three-field system. Under this system, one field was planted with winter wheat or rye, another with spring barley or oats, and the third field was left fallow to recover. The fallow period allowed the soil to rest and regain nutrients. This system had multiple benefits. It reduced soil erosion, increased crop yields, and helped prevent pests and diseases from spreading through continuous planting of the same crops. Crop rotation also allowed farmers to diversify their food production, which was particularly useful in the event of a bad harvest. If one crop failed, farmers could rely on another. This diversity of crops, coupled with the rotational system, made farming in medieval England more sustainable, especially for those who had limited access to land. Medieval farmers did not rely solely on crops for their livelihood. Livestock played a crucial role in the agricultural system, providing food, labor, and materials for clothing and tools. The most common livestock animals were cattle, sheep, and pigs. Oxen were the primary draft animals used for ploughing and hauling heavy loads. Their strength and endurance made them invaluable on the farm, and they were often the farmer's most important assets. While oxen were slow compared to horses, they were better suited for the rough, heavy soils found in England's fields. They were used to plough the land and pull carts carrying harvested grain to storage. Sheep were raised for their wool, which was spun into cloth, and their meat. Wool production was an important aspect of medieval agriculture, and it became a significant industry in England. The rise of sheep farming led to the development of the wool trade, which brought wealth to the country. Sheep were also kept for milk, and their manure was used to fertilize the land. Pigs, which were often allowed to roam freely in the forest, were another important source of food. They provided meat, which could be salted and stored for the winter. Pigs were particularly important in rural areas where meat might not be as readily available. The availability of pigs for slaughter, combined with the ability to preserve their meat, helped sustain peasant families through the harsh winter months. In addition to manual labor and animal power, medieval farmers began to harness the power of wind and water to increase their efficiency. The introduction of watermills and windmills in the medieval period had a profound impact on farming productivity. Watermills, which were powered by rivers and streams, were used to grind grain into flour. This allowed farmers to process their crops much faster and more efficiently than they could by hand. Windmills, which began to appear in England during the 12th century, were used primarily for grinding grain, but they were also employed for other tasks such as pumping water and grinding spices. The windmill's ability to harness the wind provided farmers with a more reliable and consistent source of power than manual labor or animal power. Both watermills and windmills significantly reduced the amount of labor needed to process crops and, in turn, freed up more time for other tasks. They were particularly important during harvest season, when farmers could not afford to waste any time. As technology improved, wind and water mills became more common and widespread, especially in areas where these natural resources were abundant. The innovations introduced during the medieval period, including the heavy plough, crop rotation, and the use of livestock, laid the foundation for modern agriculture. These early farming techniques allowed medieval society to sustain growing populations and supported the expansion of towns and cities. Despite the harsh conditions, these innovations were crucial to the survival of the farmer and the economy as a whole. While many of the techniques used by medieval farmers may seem simple compared to today's methods, they were the result of generations of practical knowledge and adaptation to the land. The legacy of these innovations can still be seen today in modern farming practices, which continue to rely on many of the principles introduced in the medieval period. As farming techniques evolved in medieval England, these innovations enabled society to grow and adapt to its needs. How did these early advancements shape the future of agriculture and help pave the way for the growth of towns and cities? And what impact did they have on the broader social and economic structures of medieval life? In medieval England, the life of a poor farmer was already fraught with difficulty. Surviving the harsh realities of feudal life, from backbreaking labor to meager rewards, was an ongoing struggle. Yet it was during times of widespread famine that the fragility of the peasant's existence was brought to the forefront. The Great Famine of 1315-1317, one of the most devastating periods in medieval history, marked a turning point in the lives of the poor farmers of England. This period of hunger, disease, and economic instability would have far-reaching consequences for medieval society, causing social upheaval and forever changing the course of agricultural and economic development in Europe. The Great Famine of the early 14th century was not a single event, but a series of crises that unfolded over a period of several years. While the immediate cause of the famine was poor harvests, the underlying reasons were far more complex. A combination of environmental, economic, and social factors converged to create a perfect storm of hardship. The climate during the early 1300s was particularly unfavorable for farming. The period known as the Little Ice Age brought cooler and wetter weather to much of Europe. In England, the result was a series of failed harvests. The rains were particularly persistent, causing flooding and ruining crops. Fields of wheat, barley, and oats were destroyed, and the harsh weather made it impossible to cultivate the soil properly. In addition, the cool temperatures led to poor growing conditions for the crops, further diminishing the harvest. The failure of the crops led to a severe shortage of food. Peasants, who were already living at the edge of subsistence, saw their stores of grain and other foodstuffs depleted. With limited options, many farmers turned to their livestock for food, but the animals themselves were soon at risk as fodder supplies dwindled. The lack of food led to widespread malnutrition, which weakened the immune systems of the population, making them more vulnerable to disease. As the famine continued, its effects rippled throughout medieval society. The poor were hit hardest, as they were the first to experience hunger and malnutrition. Many peasant families, who had already been living on the margins, began to starve. The lack of proper nutrition made it difficult for people to fight off illness, and the combination of famine and disease created a deadly cycle. The most devastating consequence of the famine was the spread of disease. The poor living conditions, weakened immune systems, and overcrowding created the perfect conditions for epidemics. The Black Death, which would later sweep through Europe in 1347, was a result of similar conditions, but in the immediate aftermath of the Great Famine, other diseases like dysentery, typhoid, and cholera ran rampant. With sanitation still rudimentary, at best, and medical knowledge limited, peasants had no means of combating these diseases. People died in staggering numbers, particularly in rural areas where famine and disease were at their most concentrated. In some regions, entire villages were wiped out. The death toll of the Great Famine is difficult to estimate, but it is believed that between 10 and 25% of Europe's population perished, with the poor farmers bearing the brunt of the suffering. The consequences of the Great Famine were not just physical, they were also economic and social. The widespread loss of life led to a severe labor shortage, which affected agriculture and many other sectors of society. With so many farmers dead, fields went untended, and agricultural productivity collapsed. This created a vicious cycle. Fewer workers meant that there was even less food, which led to even more starvation and further depopulation. The economic consequences of the famine were felt across Europe. The loss of farmers and the destruction of crops meant that food prices soared, and what little food was available became increasingly expensive. For the peasants who survived, life became even more difficult. They were forced to pay higher rents and tithes to their lords, even as their own resources dwindled. The feudal system, which was already heavily weighted in favor of the lords, became even more exploitative during this time. Lords, who had lost much of their labor force, demanded higher payments and services from the surviving peasants, adding to the hardship. In the wake of the famine, there was also social unrest. The lower classes, already discontent with the feudal system, began to question the established order. The severe hardship of the Great Famine deepened resentment against the nobility and the church. Peasants were increasingly dissatisfied with the system that allowed them to work endlessly for their lords, while being left to starve during times of crisis. This unrest was not limited to England. Across Europe, the famine helped to spark a series of revolts, including the well-known French Jacquerie of 1358, and later the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381. These uprisings, though not directly caused by the famine alone, were certainly influenced by the years of hardship that the peasants had endured. The Great Famine, in many ways, was a precursor to the social upheavals that would follow in the coming decades. In the years following the Great Famine, England, like much of Europe, slowly began to recover. The immediate loss of life and the depletion of resources made the rebuilding process slow and difficult. However, over time, farming methods improved and new crops were introduced that helped increase yields. The increased use of crop rotation, which had been practiced in some areas, became more widespread and helped restore soil fertility. New agricultural technologies were also introduced in the centuries that followed, including the use of windmills and watermills, which made the grinding of grain more efficient. These changes helped to stabilize food production, and by the mid-14th century, the worst of the famine's effects had begun to subside. However, the psychological and social effects of the Great Famine lingered for generations. The trauma of witnessing widespread death, the breakdown of social order, and the loss of trust in the feudal system left lasting scars on the population. The changes to the structure of medieval society would have profound implications for the future. Peasants, having survived the worst of the crisis, began to demand more rights and better treatment from their lords, leading to gradual shifts in the balance of power between the peasantry and the aristocracy. The Great Famine serves as a stark reminder of the vulnerability of medieval society and the precariousness of life for the poor. It highlights how a combination of environmental, economic and social factors can lead to widespread devastation. For the poor farmers of medieval England, the famine represented the ultimate test of survival, a challenge that would change the course of their lives and reshape the future of agriculture in Europe. While the immediate aftermath of the Great Famine saw a return to feudal exploitation, the long-term effects of the famine contributed to the eventual decline of the feudal system. The peasants who survived learned to adapt to the changing world, developing new farming techniques and pushing for greater social and political reforms. In this sense, the Great Famine, though devastating, played a part in the larger transformation of medieval society, paving the way for the changes that would come with the Renaissance and beyond. The Great Famine of the early 14th century not only devastated the population, but also set the stage for social, political, and economic changes that would shape the future of medieval Europe. How did the trauma of the famine change the way society viewed the feudal system? And what long-term effects did it have on agriculture and social structure? In the ancient world, where communication across long distances was a difficult and time-consuming task, the Romans built one of the most advanced postal systems in history. The Roman postal system, known as the cursus publicus, played a crucial role in maintaining the empire's vast territorial integrity, enabling the flow of information, military orders, and government decrees across the far-flung provinces. It was an early precursor to modern postal systems, laying the foundation for how societies would exchange messages in the centuries to come. The Roman Empire stretched from Britain to the Middle East, covering vast distances that today would seem nearly impossible to traverse in such a short time. The Romans, however, managed to build a communication system that connected all corners of their empire. At the core of this system was the cursus publicus, which allowed for the rapid delivery of messages and the transportation of goods across the empire. The origins of the Roman postal system can be traced back to the early days of the Republic, around the 3rd century BCE. However, it wasn't until the reign of Emperor Augustus in the 1st century BCE that the postal system began to take shape in its more recognizable form. Augustus recognized the importance of communication for the governance of the empire and established the cursus publicus as a government-run postal service that would serve the state, its officials, and the military. The cursus publicus was not a commercial service. Its primary purpose was to serve the needs of the Roman state. It allowed officials to send messages between Rome and the provinces, ensured the rapid communication of imperial decrees, and facilitated the movement of military and administrative personnel across the empire. For the Romans, a well-functioning postal system was vital to maintaining order and control over the vast territories they governed. The cursus publicus operated through a network of stations, known as mutations and stations. These were relay points set up at regular intervals along the major roads of the empire. The mutations were the places where horses and mules were changed, allowing couriers to continue their journey without delay. The stations were larger, rest stations that provided food, shelter, and fresh animals for the travelers. These stations were strategically placed to ensure that the couriers could travel long distances in a relatively short period of time. To make the system as efficient as possible, the Romans implemented strict regulations regarding the use of the postal network. The cursus publicus was primarily used by government officials, military personnel, and the wealthy elite. Ordinary citizens were not permitted to use the service unless they had special permission from the emperor. The system was organized to ensure that official communications, such as military orders and legal decrees, could travel quickly and securely from one part of the empire to another. The cursus publicus was staffed by a variety of personnel, including couriers, station masters, and stable hands. The couriers, known as cursores, were the backbone of the system. They were highly trained runners or horse riders who traveled from one station to another, carrying important messages. Some couriers were able to cover incredible distances in short amounts of time, racing across the Roman roads with precision and speed. The postal network was thus not only a technological marvel, but also a logistical feat, requiring careful coordination between stations and personnel. One of the most important aspects of the cursus publicus was the infrastructure it relied on, the Roman road network. The Romans were renowned for their engineering skills, and their roads were among the best in the ancient world. Constructed with layers of materials for durability and designed to allow water to drain easily, Roman roads connected the empire's cities and military outposts. The roads were the key to the success of the postal system, as they allowed the couriers to travel quickly and efficiently across vast distances. Major roads, such as the Appian Way, Via Appia, linked Rome to the far reaches of the empire, while smaller roads connected the various provinces to one another. The roads were designed for both military and civilian use, with mile markers, known as milliaria, placed at regular intervals to measure distance. Roman roads were incredibly advanced for their time. They were wide enough for 2 chariots to pass, side by side, and were paved with stone, making them far superior to the dirt paths used by other ancient civilizations. These roads allowed for the swift transportation of goods, troops, and, of course, the postal service. The Roman road network was a monumental achievement in infrastructure, and its legacy can still be seen today in the modern transportation networks of Europe. The roads not only facilitated communication, but also contributed to the economic prosperity of the empire, as they allowed for the easy movement of trade goods and people. The efficiency of the Roman postal system was astonishing for its time. Couriers using the cursus publicus could travel up to 50 miles per day, depending on the terrain and the condition of the roads. This was an incredible speed, considering the lack of modern vehicles and the primitive conditions under which the couriers worked. Some elite couriers, known for their exceptional speed, could even cover distances of 75 miles or more in a single day. To ensure this efficiency, the cursus publicus relied heavily on the use of fresh horses, which were exchanged at each station. The Romans also used a relay system, where couriers would pass their messages to another runner or rider at each station, allowing for continuous travel. The system was designed to keep messages moving quickly and securely, ensuring that the government could respond rapidly to any threats or changes in the empire. The efficiency of the Roman postal system was essential for military communication. In times of war, messages needed to travel quickly to ensure that military leaders could coordinate their actions across different fronts. The ability to send and receive orders in a timely manner was a critical factor in the success of Roman military campaigns. While the cursus publicus was primarily used for official purposes, it also played a significant role in the daily life of Roman citizens. Government officials relied on the postal system to carry out their duties, and the emperor used it to communicate with provincial governors, military commanders, and other officials throughout the empire. One of the key benefits of the postal system was its role in the dissemination of laws and imperial decrees. The cursus publicus ensured that new laws could be communicated quickly and effectively across the empire, creating a uniform legal system. In an empire as vast as Rome, this was crucial for maintaining control and ensuring that the imperial government's authority was respected everywhere. The cursus publicus was also used for the delivery of goods, including tax payments, legal documents, and messages between cities. It helped to promote the flow of information, allowing Roman society to function smoothly and efficiently. The efficiency of the postal system played a key role in the Roman Empire's ability to govern effectively over such a large territory. The cursus publicus was a groundbreaking achievement in the history of communication, allowing the Roman Empire to maintain control over its vast territories. Its efficiency and speed were unmatched for centuries, and its influence can still be seen in modern postal and communication systems. How did this early postal system influence the governance of the Roman Empire, and what legacy did it leave for future societies? The cursus publicus may have been a sophisticated postal system, but at the heart of its efficiency and speed were the couriers who carried messages across the vast expanse of the Roman Empire. These couriers, known as cursores, were the lifeblood of the system, racing between relay stations and ensuring that communication moved as swiftly as possible. But what was it like for these early postal workers? Traveling across treacherous terrain, delivering vital information while carrying the weight of imperial authority on their shoulders. The couriers of the cursus publicus were typically highly trained individuals, accustomed to long journeys, harsh conditions, and the responsibility of delivering critical messages. They were not just messengers, they were integral to the function of the Roman state, ensuring that the emperor's orders and government decrees reached even the most distant corners of the empire. The life of a cursor was not an easy one. Couriers had to travel at a remarkable pace, sometimes covering up to 50 miles in a single day, depending on the terrain and the urgency of the message. To facilitate this speed, they used a relay system, passing messages from one courier to the next at each station. But the couriers did not just carry scrolls or documents. They also had to ensure that the messages were secure and accurately delivered, often under pressure and with little time to rest. Roman couriers were typically selected for their physical fitness, stamina, and reliability. They had to be able to handle long hours in the saddle or running, navigating the treacherous Roman roads and handling the rigors of changing weather conditions. In the absence of modern vehicles, the couriers relied on horses or mules for transportation, and their success depended largely on the quality of the horses they used. These animals were carefully chosen for their speed and endurance, ensuring that the couriers could travel as swiftly as possible. The courier's journey was rarely simple or straightforward. While the cursus publicus was efficient, the roads themselves could be dangerous. The Roman Empire, for all its power and reach, was not always safe. Bandits roamed some of the more isolated roads, and the weather could also pose serious challenges. Storms, floods, and harsh winters would sometimes delay the couriers, requiring them to find shelter in roadside inns or stations until conditions improved. The couriers were also vulnerable to the natural dangers of the road, from wild animals to sudden injuries caused by accidents or rough terrain. Despite these challenges, the couriers were well compensated for their work and their importance to the functioning of the Roman state could not be overstated. Their role as trusted agents of the empire meant that they were often treated with respect, both by their fellow Romans and by the local populations through which they travelled. The relay system was the key to the cursus publicus's success. This system, known as the mutationes and stationes, was a network of stations spaced along the major roads of the empire. At each station, the courier would switch to a fresh horse or mule, allowing them to continue their journey without delay. These stations were essential for ensuring the rapid movement of messages across the empire, as they provided rest and supplies for the couriers. The relay system was organized so that couriers could travel from one station to the next, covering vast distances without the need to stop for extended periods. The stations themselves were strategically located along key roads, allowing couriers to travel from one major city to another in a matter of days. The stations provided not only fresh animals, but also food and shelter for the couriers, and sometimes even a place to rest briefly before continuing their journey. For the courier, this relay system was essential to their success. They could travel day and night, stopping only briefly at each station to change horses or grab a quick meal. The speed of the system meant that messages could travel incredibly quickly, especially in times of crisis. If an emperor needed to send an urgent military order or inform his generals about a change in tactics, the relay system allowed that message to reach its destination with remarkable efficiency. The cursus publicus was also supported by a network of personnel who worked at the stations. These workers, known as stationarii, were responsible for ensuring that the relay system ran smoothly. They would manage the animals, provide fresh supplies, and make sure the couriers were properly rested before they continued on their journey. In addition, the stationarii would often take care of administrative tasks, such as logging the arrival and departure of couriers and ensuring the security of the station's supplies. The role of the cursor was of particular importance in times of war. The Roman military relied heavily on swift communication to coordinate the movements of legions across vast distances. The courier would often be entrusted with delivering military orders, updates on troop movements, and reports from the front lines to commanders back in Rome or in provincial capitals. The speed at which military orders could be transmitted across the empire was a key factor in the Roman military's success. The cursus publicus ensured that the army could respond quickly to threats or changes in strategy. Whether it was the deployment of troops to a newly discovered frontier or an urgent command from the emperor, the couriers were there to ensure that the message was received and acted upon swiftly. The efficiency of the Roman postal system also helped to create a sense of cohesion within the Roman military. Even when soldiers were stationed in remote parts of the empire, they could be kept up to date on developments back in Rome. The courier acted as the lifeline between the front lines and the imperial leadership, ensuring that orders were followed, and the military remained unified in its goals. While the couriers were primarily used for government and military purposes, their presence also had an impact on civilian life. As the cursus publicus grew in efficiency, it enabled the exchange of goods, legal documents, and private letters between distant regions. This helped to foster economic activity by allowing merchants to send orders and payment across the empire, and it helped to facilitate cultural exchange between different provinces. For the wealthy elite, the courier system allowed for the swift movement of correspondence. Letters from family members or business partners could be delivered with a speed that was unheard of in other parts of the ancient world. The cursus publicus became a vital tool not only for the administration of the empire, but also for the Roman citizenry, who could now communicate over long distances with a level of efficiency that would later influence the development of modern postal systems. Despite its incredible success, the Roman postal system began to decline during the later stages of the empire. The rise of barbarian invasions and the instability caused by internal strife disrupted the cursus publicus, and the decline of Roman infrastructure made it difficult to maintain the relay stations and road networks that had once been the backbone of the postal system. By the 5th century CE, with the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the postal system effectively collapsed in many regions. However, the legacy of the cursus publicus lived on. The concept of a state-run postal system would influence later systems of communication in Europe. Even though the Roman postal service was no longer in operation, its basic principles, such as the use of relay stations and couriers to transport messages, would continue to influence the development of postal systems in medieval and early modern Europe. The Roman courier system was one of the most sophisticated communication networks of the ancient world, crucial to both military success and the day-to-day functioning of the empire. How did the efficiency of the cursus publicus contribute to the Roman Empire's dominance? And what can we learn from this system about the role of communication in governance? As the Roman Empire expanded, the need for a reliable and efficient postal system became ever more critical. However, as time wore on and the empire began to unravel, so too did the intricate infrastructure that once held it together. The fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 CE marked a significant turning point, not just for political control and military structure, but for communication networks across the empire. The cursus publicus, once a symbol of Roman efficiency, fell into disrepair, with its legacy fading until it was resurrected centuries later in various forms. Despite the advancements of Roman communication systems, the decline of the postal service in the empire was inevitable. Understanding the reasons behind this decline, as well as its eventual impact on Europe's subsequent development, provides valuable insights into how communication systems evolve and how the collapse of communication infrastructure can hasten the decline of a civilization. The gradual decline of the Roman Empire in the 4th and 5th centuries CE placed enormous strain on the cursus publicus. The empire was beset by internal struggles, with constant political instability weakening central authority. As civil wars raged and power struggles intensified, the resources and personnel required to maintain a state-run postal system became more scarce. The Roman government found itself unable to sustain the same level of efficiency that had been established under emperors like Augustus. A combination of political instability, economic hardship, and corruption led to the decline of the Roman postal system. Funds that had previously been allocated to maintaining the roads, stations, and horses that were essential to the cursus publicus were redirected elsewhere or completely depleted. In the absence of centralized control, local officials in some provinces neglected their duties to ensure the maintenance of these vital communication routes. Moreover, the pressures from within the empire, including the rise of powerful regional leaders and military commanders, made it difficult for the Roman government to maintain control over distant provinces. The cursus publicus relied heavily on a well-organized bureaucracy to coordinate the movement of messages and goods, but as political power fractured, the central authority lost its grip on this crucial service. Consequently, the once stable postal network began to break down, undermining the very foundation that had supported the Roman Empire's ability to govern such a vast territory. Perhaps the most significant factor contributing to the collapse of the Roman postal system was the barbarian invasions that began in the 5th century. The Western Roman Empire was under constant attack by various Germanic tribes, such as the Visigoths, Vandals, and Ostrogoths, who systematically breached the empire's borders. The sack of Rome in 410 CE by the Visigoths, followed by the fall of the city in 476 CE to Odoacer, effectively marked the end of the Western Roman Empire. As barbarian tribes advanced through the empire, they often targeted the very infrastructure that had supported Roman society, including roads, cities, and communication networks. In some cases, the invading forces simply destroyed Roman relay stations and left the roads impassable. The roads that had once connected the empire's cities and provinces now became overrun with bandits and marauders, further crippling the ability to transport messages and goods. Without the necessary protection and infrastructure, the cursus publicus system fell into disarray. The delivery of imperial decrees and military orders became impossible. With no communication infrastructure to coordinate defenses, the ability of the Roman authorities to respond quickly to threats or maintain control over their provinces weakened. The result was a fragmented empire, with regions unable to communicate efficiently with the central government, leading to a power vacuum and further instability. As the empire fragmented and internal divisions deepened, the extensive network of Roman roads began to fall into disrepair. Many of the roads that had once been meticulously constructed and maintained by Roman engineers became neglected. Weeds grew over the cobblestones, and cracks in the roadbed worsened as time passed. The loss of road maintenance meant that the travel time between towns and cities increased, and the security of these roads deteriorated. The once pristine Roman roads, which had been vital for both military campaigns and communication, became hazardous and impassable. The lack of a functioning postal system compounded the difficulties faced by the remaining Roman bureaucracy. Even as the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, continued to thrive, the Roman roads in the West, particularly those used by the cursus publicus, were left in ruins. In addition to the roads, the relay stations that had once served as crucial stops for travelers and couriers also fell into disrepair. These stations, which had been stocked with fresh horses, food, and supplies, were abandoned, leaving no infrastructure to support the transmission of messages. The decline of these vital resources meant that the cursus publicus became nothing more than a distant memory, a relic of a bygone age. Although the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 CE marked the end of the cursus publicus in the West, the postal system did not vanish entirely. The Eastern Roman Empire, or Byzantine Empire, continued to operate with many of the same systems that had supported Roman rule. The cursus publicus system was adapted and maintained in the Byzantine Empire for several centuries, and it became an essential part of Byzantine governance. The Byzantines, facing their own challenges and the external threat of invasions, recognized the importance of communication in maintaining their empire. They continued to use relay stations and mounted couriers to carry official messages across the empire. While the system in the Byzantine Empire was not as extensive as it had been under Augustus, it nonetheless served a crucial role in maintaining imperial control, especially during times of war. The Byzantine postal system, however, was ultimately no match for the growing influence of Islamic empires and the gradual expansion of Europe's medieval kingdoms. As the Byzantines faced increasing pressure from invading forces, the cursus publicus system in the East slowly declined. The eventual rise of medieval European kingdoms, including the Holy Roman Empire, would lead to the development of their own postal systems, inspired in part by the Roman legacy. While the cursus publicus came to an end in the 5th century, its legacy lived on in the postal systems that followed. The concept of using relay stations and couriers to move messages quickly across vast distances became a model for future empires and kingdoms. The importance of maintaining communication networks would be seen again in the Renaissance and in the development of modern postal systems. The Roman postal system's influence can still be seen in the infrastructure of modern communication systems. The principles of rapid communication, relay systems, and the establishment of centralized networks have all persisted throughout history, from the medieval period to the digital age. The Romans, with their roads, stations, and couriers, set the stage for the global communication systems we rely on today. The decline of the Roman postal system was a critical moment in the empire's fall, marking the breakdown of communication and the end of an era of centralized authority. Despite this collapse, the legacy of Roman communication systems continued to shape the world for centuries to come. How did the breakdown of the cursus publicus affect the collapse of the Roman Empire? And what can we learn from its eventual resurgence in the Byzantine Empire about the lasting importance of communication in governance? In the mid-19th century, London was a city of stark contrasts. The grandeur of the expanding metropolis was matched only by its squalor. For every stately mansion or bustling market street, there was a labyrinth of dark alleys, overcrowded tenements, and hidden dangers lurking beneath the surface. While the Industrial Revolution brought wealth and progress to the city, it also gave rise to an entirely new set of problems, none more pressing than the issue of sanitation. London, by the 1800s, had grown into one of the largest and most important cities in the world. But as the population boomed, the city's infrastructure struggled to keep pace. With no formal waste management system, sewage was either dumped directly into the River Thames or left to fester in the streets, creating health hazards and contributing to the spread of disease. By the mid-century, the smell of human waste and rotting refuse hung in the air, suffocating the city's progress. But beneath the ground, a small group of workers, often forgotten by history, were labouring in the depths of the city's sewers, fighting to keep London from drowning in filth. These workers, known as sewermen, were tasked with maintaining and expanding the sewer system. Their job was dirty, dangerous, and often deadly. The conditions they worked in were appalling, yet they were among the unsung heroes who kept the city from becoming uninhabitable. The sewers were a hidden world, only visible to those who worked within them, and yet they were central to the health and well-being of the population above. Before the 19th century, London had no formal sewer system. Instead, waste was disposed of in a haphazard and unsanitary manner. The wealthy had privies, or toilets, but these were often little more than wooden outhouses placed over cesspits or open drains. For the poor, waste disposal was even more primitive. In many areas, people simply discarded their waste into the streets, where it would mix with the filth of the city. Over time, the buildup of refuse created an environment ripe for disease. By the early 19th century, London's rapid growth exacerbated these problems. The population of the city grew from around 1 million in 1800 to nearly 3 million by 1850. With no effective waste management system, human waste, animal carcasses, and industrial runoff quickly accumulated. The lack of proper sanitation contributed to outbreaks of deadly diseases such as cholera, typhus, and dysentery, which claimed thousands of lives each year. It was clear that something had to be done. In 1858, after a particularly severe cholera outbreak, a new solution was proposed, one that would change the face of sanitation in London forever. The plan was to build a comprehensive network of sewers that would carry waste away from the city and into the River Thames. This was a monumental undertaking, requiring thousands of workers, engineers, and labourers to dig tunnels beneath the city. At the heart of this vast and ambitious project were the men who worked in the sewers, the sewer men. These workers, often recruited from the poorest classes of society, were tasked with digging the tunnels and maintaining the underground network. Their job was both physically demanding and perilous, and they faced an array of dangers as they toiled in the darkness below ground. The sewers themselves were not clean, well-maintained structures. In fact, they were little more than crude, unlit tunnels that were often narrow and filled with stagnant water, filth, and dangerous gases. Workers had to navigate their way through these tunnels using only lanterns to light their path, inhaling the foul air and dealing with the constant risk of collapse. The smell was overwhelming, a combination of human waste, rotting food, and stagnant water. To make matters worse, sewer men were exposed to the risk of drowning, as the tunnels were prone to flooding during heavy rains. Workers could easily become trapped if a tunnel collapsed, and many sewer men perished in this way. There was also the constant danger of disease. The very filth they were tasked with removing carried deadly pathogens, and even the strongest workers could succumb to illness after prolonged exposure. Despite the hazards, sewer men worked in shifts to ensure that London's sewage system continued to function. They used picks, shovels, and rudimentary tools to dig tunnels, clear blockages, and expand the system. Their work was often done in near-complete darkness, as the tunnels were poorly lit, and the heat and humidity made conditions unbearable. The workers had little to no protective gear, and many suffered from respiratory diseases, skin infections, and other illnesses as a result of their exposure to the filth. The work of the sewer men was central to addressing London's health crisis. The new sewer system, designed by the engineer Joseph Bazalgette, was a groundbreaking achievement that would ultimately help save thousands of lives. Bazalgette's design incorporated large, durable tunnels capable of carrying waste and sewage away from the city and out into the Thames. The sewers were constructed to accommodate the growing population of London, and the work done by the sewer men was crucial to the system's success. The sewers were built using brick arches and tunnels that could withstand the pressure of the city above. The workers had to dig deep into the earth to create these channels, often having to tunnel through layers of dirt, stone, and even clay. Once completed, the sewers would carry waste away from residential areas, keeping it out of sight and, ideally, out of the water supply. In addition to the construction of the sewers, the sewer men were also tasked with cleaning and maintaining them. The tunnels would periodically need to be emptied of sludge and waste, and workers were often required to enter the sewers to remove blockages caused by debris, grease, or human waste. In some cases, the workers were even required to clear dead animals or other dangerous materials from the system. While the work of the sewer men was largely invisible to the general public, it was essential to the functioning of London's sanitation system. Their labour helped to keep the city from becoming overwhelmed by waste, and their efforts were a critical factor in reducing the spread of disease. In the end, the sewer men's hard work contributed to the establishment of a functioning sewage system that would become a model for other cities around the world. Despite the vital role they played in keeping the city healthy and functional, the sewer men were often forgotten by history. Their labour was seen as dirty and thankless, and they received little recognition for their contribution to society. Most of the workers were poor and from the working class, and their stories were overshadowed by the more glamorous achievements of the Victorian era. However, the legacy of the sewer men is undeniable. Their hard work and perseverance helped to transform London from a city plagued by disease and filth into a cleaner, healthier place. The construction of the sewer system and the tireless efforts of those who worked in the sewers laid the foundation for modern urban sanitation systems. Today, the work of the sewer men is often overlooked, but their contributions to public health cannot be overstated. The Victorian sewer system was one of the most advanced of its time, and it helped to set the standard for modern sewage systems worldwide. Without the efforts of the sewer men, London's transformation into a modern, thriving metropolis would not have been possible. The work of the sewer men was vital to the survival and development of London in the 19th century. Despite the dangers and hardships they faced, they laid the groundwork for the city's modern sanitation systems. How did their labour contribute to the improvement of public health? And what can we learn from their forgotten role in shaping the infrastructure of the modern world? In the 19th century, London was a city teeming with life, yet it was also a city drowning in filth. The rapid industrialization and urbanization of the city had transformed it into a bustling metropolis. But with this growth came severe public health issues. Overcrowding, poor sanitation, and the lack of an efficient waste disposal system created a breeding ground for diseases such as cholera, typhus, and dysentery, which devastated the population. The situation in London was dire. By the 1830s and 1840s, outbreaks of cholera were occurring at an alarming rate. The disease, which spread rapidly through contaminated water and food, claimed thousands of lives, particularly in the poorest districts. The unsanitary conditions in the city were directly responsible for the spread of cholera, as well as other waterborne diseases. The River Thames, once the lifeblood of the city, had become a polluted cesspool, carrying waste and filth from the streets straight into the water supply. At the time, the connection between sanitation and public health was not fully understood. Medical knowledge was still rudimentary, and many believed that diseases were spread by miasma, bad air, or foul vapors, rather than through contaminated water. However, the increasing frequency of cholera outbreaks and the mounting public health crisis eventually led to a paradigm shift in how sanitation was viewed. The turning point came with the work of Dr. John Snow, a physician who is often credited with pioneering the field of epidemiology. During the 1854 cholera outbreak, Snow investigated the cause of the disease and famously linked it to a contaminated water pump on Broad Street in Soho. This discovery helped to establish the connection between poor sanitation and disease, and underscored the urgent need for a proper sewer system to protect public health. In response to the public health crisis and the mounting pressure to address the issue of sanitation, the British government appointed civil engineer Joseph Bazalgette to design and build a comprehensive sewer system for London. Bazalgette, whose work would go on to define urban planning for generations, recognized the importance of creating an infrastructure that could safely remove waste from the city and prevent contamination of the water supply. Bazalgette's solution was a bold one. He designed a vast network of sewers that would intercept waste from London's streets and direct it to treatment plants and out to the River Thames, away from the city's population. This system was revolutionary for its time, incorporating large brick-lined sewers capable of carrying immense amounts of waste. Bazalgette's plan was ambitious, requiring the construction of hundreds of miles of tunnels beneath London. The construction of this sewer system was no small feat. It required thousands of workers, many of whom were the sewer men, labourers, who dug the tunnels and built the infrastructure that would ultimately change the course of public health in London. These workers, often labouring in cramped, filthy conditions, were responsible for laying the foundations of the modern sanitation system. Their work was grueling and dangerous, but their efforts would help to save countless lives in the years to come. Bazalgette's sewer system, completed in 1865, marked a turning point in the fight against disease in London. The new system was designed to carry waste away from populated areas, preventing it from contaminating drinking water and creating a breeding ground for disease. For the first time, London had a modern waste disposal system that could effectively manage the enormous volume of human waste generated by its growing population. The impact of the sewer system on public health was immediate. Following the completion of the sewers, the number of cholera outbreaks in London dropped dramatically. The city's population, which had previously been plagued by frequent epidemics, began to experience longer periods of health and stability. With the majority of waste now safely carried away from homes and water sources, the risk of disease transmission was significantly reduced. While the sewer system did not completely eradicate disease, it was a critical factor in improving public health in the long term. Cholera, which had once ravaged London, was no longer a constant threat. In the years that followed the construction of the sewers, other diseases such as typhus and dysentery became less prevalent, and the overall health of the population improved. The success of Bazalgette's sewer system was a testament to the power of sanitation in preventing disease. It was a clear example of how infrastructure and public health policies could go hand in hand to improve the well-being of society as a whole. London's sewer system became a model for other cities, and its design influenced modern sewer systems around the world. The creation of a centralized, efficient sanitation system was one of the most important public health achievements of the 19th century, and it was built on the backs of the forgotten sewer men who made it possible.